Welcome to Opening Minds, Opening Hearts, a podcast about the transformative practice of centering prayer. In each episode, we will talk to friends of contemplative outreach about their personal practice. Listen in as our guests share insights about the teachings of Father Thomas Keating, how the practice impacts their work in the world, and their thoughts about how centering prayer connects to the living traditions of contemplation and meditation. We are your hosts, Colleen Thomas
and Mark Dannenfelser,
centering prayer practitioners and contemplative life seekers who love to talk a little too much about how the practice of contemplative prayer transforms our inner and outer worlds. Our hope is to open the door for you to explore more deeply this powerful practice of centering prayer. Hello, everyone, and hello, Mark. How you doing?
Hi, Colleen. I'm doing good. And hello to everyone else out there.
If you're still listening, and we hope you are, because we've been having some really good conversations. Unfortunately, for this episode, it's just me and Mark.
Yeah, it's unfortunate for you and for us, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a little strange to know if anybody is listening. It could be just us talking to ourselves.
And if that's all it is, that's fine.
I enjoy talking with you.
I enjoy talking with you too. We need no audience. Just like the Snowmass folks, we don't need an audience.
No, it's not that we don't care about our audience. We just don't need them. Is that what you're saying?
That is exactly what I'm saying.
But we're happy. If you're listening, we're happy you are.
We are happy if you're listening, and we're really happy if you've been listening to the last several episodes, because we were so delighted to be engaged in these conversations. You know, it's like we've been learning so much, and just there's been such a rich dialogue with all of our guests.
Oh, totally. I'm really been inspired. Certainly this first half of the season, and we're only halfway through too. But the breadth of guests that we have and the depth of what they're sharing is, for me, it's been personally inspiring and moving. I hope that's true for others as well.
Yeah, hopefully so. We said that we wanted to be students this season, and in a lot of ways, we have been. What our hope for this, what we're calling this, is a mid-season reflection. We've talked to Nathaniel and Cynthia and Mirabai and Jim Finley, and these are just, for me, I consider like rock stars of contemplative spirituality. So to say I've taken the posture of student is to say it lightly. I'm surprised in listening back to the episodes, to be honest, that I even had a question, a follow-up question, or even anything to contribute to the conversation.
Yeah, talk about fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking to people who are steeped in this and have made a whole life of this. We have, in our own little way, done that too. But these guys are highly respected in the field, not in that way that's the elites. And that's the other thing that's really impressed me, how accessible all of our guests have been so far, even though these people were very highly regarded and well-known. But
yeah, they're not showing up for us, by the way. What they are showing up for, that we've learned over the past 2 seasons, is if people just love and respect Thomas Keating so much, they really do.
That's the other thing that's impressed me too, is each guest has this kind of affection for and respect for the work of Thomas Keating, and a connection, a deep connection to who he was and to him and his work. And that's a lot of what we're doing this season, is it not? We're hearing from other people, but we're seeing the connections back to Thomas and the centering prayer movement and the contemplative outreach community.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing too, in their affection for him, it's very timely with Cynthia's book that's just been released, right? Because she's titled this The Making of a Modern Day Mystic. And for me, my studies of contemplative Christian spirituality, they did begin with Father Thomas, but also this mystical tradition harkens us back to people like the people that we think about as mystics, like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. So to be welcoming Thomas Keating into the canon of mystics in this way is pretty profound.
And then to have somebody like Cynthia Bourgeault, who in her own right is part of that as well in terms of her own teaching, but to have her be pointing to Thomas Keating's work and saying, yes, he belongs in this tradition and he's a significant figure in it. It reaffirms what we know by experience in terms of the practice itself and reading some of his stuff, but it's much bigger than that. Like, I benefited from him. She's saying he belongs in that lineage.
And he truly does, especially as for me, this season so far has been a really deepening of my education, I almost want to say, of the tradition of Christian spirituality, because we moved, as we talked about in our first episode, you and I were swimming in these deeper waters of Christian non-duality. And that has been an actual real living practice for me. I'm still slow reading Reflections on the Unknowable. And you know what happened that's actually fascinating is that I got stuck on one chapter and I've been reading it daily, like a daily reflection. It's so deep that it's like reading Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle. I can't move on to the next dwelling.
Right. Stuck in one dwelling, right. Which I think is wonderful, actually, because I've experienced a similar thing too, and there's a difference for me where I can read things almost I consume the next series on, I don't want to name any one of the platforms. Yeah. I'm just like consuming it, where what you're saying sounds like, no, you're sitting with that and absorbing it. And it's different than like, oh, just give me more of that. And that's great. And this, I think, comes through in our guests too, as they talk. They have gone deep into this. It's not just like, what's the next shiny object that I'll talk about.
It reminds me of Mirabai in her episode talking about how she's sitting surrounded by all of the sacred texts and she's read every single one of them. There's this living in the practice and the tradition, and it can last for a lifetime. And now at this point in Mirabai's life, I think she said she's in her 60s now, she's letting go of the sacred texts and finding the holy and the sacred in these more ordinary moments that those texts aren't doing it for her anymore. But she has walked through them all and probably many, many times, and now has arrived at this place where, oh, all things are sacred.
We've heard that in our guests this first half of the season. We've heard a similar thing. You go deep into your own tradition and deep into the practice, and it actually opens you up. There's more fluidity and flexibility in seeing that in other practices and other traditions. And Mirabai said that you can visit an ashram in the Himalayas or kneel in a church pew to connect to the spirit or examine life's big question. Like, you can get there in different traditions. So there's no like one true church idea. It's like, no, if I'm true to my tradition, it's going to open me up to see spirit in throughout.
Well, and it makes me think, how we say there's one true God, or is it like Father Thomas writes later, God is all in all. I'll share this quote because this comes from the chapter in Nathaniel's book that he edited, actually, which is a transcript in a way, a creative transcript of the Snowmass dialogues. It's not a transcript of an actual conference that they had, but it's designed to reflect the experience that they had in being together with everyone. And in this chapter, Father Thomas is saying they called this chapter the Gates of Unity. He says, There are thousands of religions in the world, all of them different, and none of them can convey through words what is beyond. But perhaps by discussing our personal experiences of that beyond, we can come up with a common vocabulary for the human experience of approaching the ultimate. And with that common vocabulary, perhaps we can achieve a measure of unity that will spread just a little peace in the world.
And that was the term they came up with, wasn't it, at the conferences that we talked a lot about so far in the first half, this ultimate reality. We asked Nathaniel about that, and I loved what he said that regarding that ultimate reality. He said you could even drop the ultimate and just call it reality. This is embedded. We all have concepts of ultimate reality or what we might call God. But he's saying, fine, but it's life itself. It's like we might say, God is love. That's a big thing, love.
Yeah. And then we'll even see too, so far, I want to say this because it's going to be a bit of a transition in the episodes to come. But so far, everyone that we've talked to have in common the practice of centering prayer. Jim doesn't call it centering prayer per se, but I know because really my practice of centering prayer in community really began with Jim's community in Santa Monica.
Jim Finley.
Jim Finley. Yep. So centering prayer so far has been a foundational practice for the guests that we've talked to. And I think that speaks to centering prayer as a universal practice because while so far all of our guests practice centering prayer, they do not all identify as Christians. Mirabai doesn't identify as a Christian. Nathaniel doesn't identify as a Christian. And yet they all practice centering prayer. And then we'll see in the episodes to come, these guests, with the exception of one, are not centering prayer practitioners. They come from different faith traditions. But yet when we ask everyone about this common vocabulary, ultimate reality, there is some common way of understanding this ultimate reality too.
And the practice part, because they really affirm that in these dialogues at Snowmass, contemplative and meditative practice was critical. It wasn't the whole thing either. So one of their points of agreement, disciplined practice is essential to the spiritual light, yet spiritual attainment is not the result of one's own efforts, but the result of an experience of oneness, the ultimate reality. And to me, one of the things I've come to so far in the season is what you were saying. All of our guests, if they're not practicing centering prayer, they're very familiar with it, and they are all affirming the significance of that as a practice. I'm coming to an understanding that centering prayer is not the be-all, end-all. It's that centering prayer, and Thomas Keating and others who put that method together, I think really just tapped into that universal thing that we can all recognize, whatever tradition we're coming from. And so it's not like you have to practice centering prayer. It's that centering prayer is so recognizable and so relatable for so many people because it is tapping into that. It's an access point to that greater thing, whatever you call it. And Nathaniel said that we may need, when he was talking about practice, spiritual practices, we may need different tools at different times.
I loved that. I also loved when he talked about being interspiritual and the need then to have an interspiritual practice. It's like there's practice is also common language. I like this language that Pema Chodron uses. She was one of the guests at the Snowmass conferences. I think the first one, maybe the first one only. You can fact check that. I highly recommend Nathaniel's book, The Common Heart. There's chunks of wisdom all throughout it from all of these different friends of Father Thomas who gathered over the years at Snowmass for these conferences. But Pema Chodron talks about maybe practice and tradition as vehicles. And she says contemplatives share the same ground of experience and use their particular vehicles to go beyond a limited perspective. And she's saying the purpose of life is to go beyond limitations, and that the point is not to depend on a perfect belief system. Maybe we could even say a perfect practice, but to move beyond dogmatic limitations, to avoid limiting, she says, the experience of reality. In some ways, practice, our tradition, as she says, is a way of assisting us to connect with wisdom. But then the pitfall is that we become limited by our vehicle, by the tradition, or maybe even by the practice itself. And the whole point of practice is to open.
In the Christian tradition, contemplative prayer is the opening of your mind and heart to God, who is beyond thoughts, words, and emotions. Centering prayer is a method designed to facilitate contemplation. The method suggests 4 guidelines. 1. Choose a sacred word as the symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within you. 2. Sit comfortably and relatively still. Close your eyes or leave them slightly open and silently introduce your sacred word. 3. When you notice you have become engaged with a thought, simply return ever so gently to your sacred word. And 4, at the end of the 20-minute prayer period, let go of the sacred word and remain in silence for a couple of minutes. The additional time invites you to bring the atmosphere of silence into everyday life. You see that in the mindfulness where I do some of my work. In the mindfulness, the research with that, because they look at what happens when you're doing these kind of practices. And there is an opening. It's clear, at least in the brain, that it's this more connecting, this kind of wider view. We call it having a non-judgmental attitude, which is a broad term for not limiting everything to, well, I like or I don't like, or I know who this person is, or not, but not having that narrow view, which you do need if you're going to make judgments to turn left or right at a stop sign, but to open it up. And it seems that these contemplative practices and meditative practices have that in common, whatever the particular is, almost to the point where it then doesn't need to even include the practice, even though we need a practice. It's what they agreed on in that principle. You need a practice to cultivate that.
Yeah, but they also said it's not essential.
Right.
And they also said you need a practice, but it's not essential to spiritual experience. Is that the term?
Yeah, that spiritual attainment is not the result. And it's not the result of just doing a practice, like the effort of our own practice. What you were saying, which is it's important to have that so that we have a structure and we have a way to work with it, but it's not the thing. It's the finger pointing to the moon, to use an overused. And this is the other thing that I really noticed in the conversation with our guests and what came out of the Snowmass dialogues. There was a strong sense of unity and friendship. Everybody there seemed to comment on that. So it's like, oh, I can see across boundary lines or people from different faiths or people I might not even associate with. Now I can be in union with and communion with. They all mentioned that, the commonness.
Yeah. I want to go back to what you were saying, though, too, about the narrowing versus the opening, because when we look ahead to the episodes that are coming up, right, with our guests who are from the Buddhist tradition, from indigenous contemplative practice perspective, Sufism, it's interesting because, and this kind of bugs me a bit, but there's just such a sincere openness in these folks from other traditions that I wish was easier to attain within the Christian tradition. You know, in some ways, it's like, as Howard Thurman would call it, this growing edge of this movement into a Christian non-duality is so important. So we're able to expand, widen, and not constrict and become so content in just our own known worlds. For me, the grace with which the guests that we talked to in the upcoming episodes was just so profound. The willingness to engage in what I considered at times to be silly questions, around how to understand a personal God, an impersonal God. But I just learned so much from their openness. And also one thing in particular with Kyra Jewel Lingo, we'll hear from in the next episode, but her story about practice on that retreat that she went to, I think it was more just like a personal retreat that she took, if I recall correctly. But her experience with the tree, Mark.
Oh, yeah.
That's openness.
And that's oneness. It becomes one then, because there's not separation. And I forget who said it this way, but non-dual in some traditions, the other way to say that is not two non-dual. And that means it's not just me and you or my religion and all other religions. It's something else, or this particular practice and then those practices over there. It's that it's all part of the same somehow without losing the individual. And Cynthia talked about this a lot too, that we can have, I guess Mirabai did too, we can have a personal God and we can have this universal God too. Like it's not mutually exclusive to have what we feel like is a one-on-one or personal or individual God that we see, but then that not limited to that too. That God is ultimate in that sense. You can't be limited by a concept or a belief system.
Yeah. It will be so good for you all as listeners to continue on this journey with us, with the guests that we have coming up, and really experience what we can only get a sense of what was modeled at the Snowmass conferences, where all of these practitioners were present and learning from one another, sharing stories. I have a better sense now of how it was that they learned the value of dialogue, the value of friendship, and just a general kind of trust to share openly without assuming knowledge of another's tradition either. And that's been really important to me in this season, just the willingness to show up, not being an expert. And this has been a challenge for Mark and I, because in the past 2 seasons, we've been talking a bit more about something that we know. We practice centering prayer. We know centering prayer. We know those foundational teachings of Father Thomas. This season, we found ourselves talking about things that we know a lot less. And in a way, I was really amazed to see how Spirit shows up in these conversations, because I really don't know. I'd still say I don't know much about Buddhism. Mark, you know more than I do about Buddhism. I really don't know anything about Islam, which surprises and kind of embarrasses me because it's such a growing population of folks in the US and around the world that practice Islam. I'd love to know more about it. I did learn a lot more about it. And really, I've never spent much time with people who practice a native indigenous spirituality. I had some sense of the values, right? Like, yes, there's a sacredness of the earth and some type of veneration of ancestors and a more inherent value of communal ways of being that are in contrast with my Western kind of formation, me, myself, I values. But it was just enough to show up in a spirit of receptivity and in a spirit of friendship and connect.
I'm finding it more accessible. And what you were saying about not knowing, I think I feel that too. And I'm becoming more comfortable with that when I'm not always very comfortable with that. That's also what we hear, that concept of not knowing and not being so assured of my position or my belief that it's not porous, it's not flexible, it's not open. I think that even about as we're looking back on the Snowmass dialogues, that what we're doing is also very current. We're not just back in the past thinking about that, or as important as those were and have set us up for our conversations this season. It's also a present moment conversation. It's a dialogue that continues. And that's partly what we're doing. We're not just reminiscing about that time. We're actually finding our way through that right now. How do we talk to people from other traditions? How do I understand my own tradition as it relates to that? And that's very exciting for me, and it's very invigorating in a way. And especially when I can recognize Christianity in Buddhism and vice versa, that you hear similar ideas if you're not caught on particular words or belief systems.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's this strong impulse to know and to understand. When I think about even the educational system, it's all based on comprehension. That really doesn't serve us well on this path. There's that St. Augustine quote that I love that says, "What you understand isn't God."
Yeah. I don't understand that quote, but yeah. And there's a freedom in that.
There is.
Merton said that too. Thomas Merton said that too when he's talking about being beginners. He said that, if you think from the beginning, you'll never come to know anything.
And isn't that a Zen Buddhist thing too? The beginner's mind?
Yeah, beginner's mind. And it's just not knowing, again, not that we don't know anything. We're not saying that, but not being so secure in that we don't realize that there's other ways to come at that or to think about that. This is why I think in those dialogues, when it came to practice and when it came to conversation, and Nathanael told us about this, how they came to valuing silence. That was the common language, not all the words and the concepts and kind of duking it out. It was that let's begin in silence. And as he said it, they practiced silence first, and then they spoke from that silence about the various aspects of their traditions and everything else that kind of came in. But that silence is the universal language.
Yeah, it's the silence, not the liturgy, not the text, which we can get really hung up on in Christianity. That liturgy, the scripture, the prayer book. I love it all too. I love all of it. I love a good liturgy.
And then we don't have to get rid of that. It's not about that, right? It's just saying that's not saying all of it. And that's in the early texts, in the Jewish text. Anyway, the creation myths talk about in the beginning, there was just a vast openness. And then God speaks into that. What we Christians would say, another name for Jesus is the Word made flesh,
That's good.
Like he speaks out of the silence. If it's a he, not a he, and then there is creation that comes from out of that silence. There's a lot of openness there, a lot of spaciousness there.
I'm also thinking of another way that God reveals something profound to us through scripture when Moses has his encounter and says, essentially, "Who are you?" And God's just like, "I am."
How's that for a non-dual statement? Yeah. I am who am. Okay, next.
But it's like the possibility in that. There's so much room and space in that for a concept of God. That's what made me think about that when you talked about the creation story too, right? That in this void, the immense possibility and creativity that came out of that nothingness. I really need to remember that.
Suggest that's the fertile ground. That's the ground. And that's the place where we're working in that place, and our guests are working in that place of this opening up to something that's so much bigger, broader, spacious than we can even imagine, which itself is a concept. So I'm just happy for us to be able to be in this place, this position where we get to have these conversations, and that we're still having them. We have a whole second half of the season.
Yeah. And I'm so grateful too, just to harken back to how we started this conversation, that there's so much affection for Father Thomas that we reach out to people and they say, sure, we'll schedule a time to talk with you. Cause that's definitely all Thomas Keating. Mark and I, before we started recording this episode, we were playing around on social media. We have no followers. They're not saying yes. These guests aren't saying yes to having a conversation with Mark and I. I'm grateful to be a space holder for these conversations, and really, especially in Mirabai's episode, felt just the spirit of Father Thomas with us in that moment as she reflected so lovingly on her time with him. Keep listening.
Yes. Colleen, I look forward to our second half, and I'm so grateful to be sharing this time with you, special time, and being able to just talk about and reflect on what's so essential, really, for us in our life. And then that we get to talk to these guests and do that together. As fumbling as we do sometimes, or I do anyway, still wonderful to be able to share this with you and with all of our listeners. So I'm looking forward to.
And with the contemplative outreach community too. Grateful too for everyone who donates to contemplative outreach, and for our grantors, Trust for Meditation process. You know, there's just a lot of support for this Opening Minds, Opening Hearts podcast. We hope you'll hang in there with us. Just a few more episodes, and then before we know it, we'll be back talking about what are we going to do for season 4. Do we have anything left to talk about?
Well, for now, it's enough to look forward to the second half of season 3. And we hope to see all of you there.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Opening Minds, Opening Hearts. Visit our website, contemplativeoutreach.org, to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at Contemplative Outreach LTD. To learn more about our guests and their work, you can find info in the show notes for each episode. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to check out our YouTube channel, COUTREACH Outreach. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. Season 3 of Opening Minds, Opening Hearts was made possible by a grant from the Trust for the Meditation Process, a charitable foundation encouraging meditation, mindfulness, and contemplative prayer. To find out more about the foundation, go to trustformeditation.org. If you are a grateful listener and would like to support this podcast, go to contemplativeoutreach.org/podcast to make a donation of any amount. And thank you for your support.